LibertyNation.com does not endorse candidates, campaigns, or legislation, and this presentation is no endorsement.
We've got a rundown of the Silicone Valley Bank collapse, the Biden gun control order, a Jussie Smollett update, and Alec and Baldwin back in the news again, all right now on this episode of The Uprising.
We are The Uprising.
Welcome back to The Uprising, a podcast of LibertyNation.com. I'm your host, Scott Cosenza, and joining me today is LibertyNation.com's senior political analyst, Mr. Timothy L. Donner. Tim, welcome
Hello,
back to the
Scott.
podcast. How are thee?
Oh, always better when I'm ready to unburden myself of the the stream of political thought that I've had in the last week.
Well, we have got two huge stories to talk about this week, and it's not the collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank and perhaps the banking system and the U.S. dollar writ large, although we will cover that with special guest, LibertyNation.com economics editor Andrew Moran. And it's not the Joe Biden executive action on gun control, Tim, which we do cover in depth with LibertyNation.com executive editor at large, James Fight, this week, coming up on this very program. No.
Oh, boy, you got all the titles right.
No.
That's impressive, Scott.
By the way, without reference, we're building
Next notes.
We're building anticipation and drama here towards the disclosure of the two stories that you and I are going to share the airwaves talking about. One of them is big news in the Alec Baldwin shooting trial, the death of Helena Hutchins, and what's going on there.
To discuss Hilaria.
And the other one is the Osundairo brothers and a Jussie Smollett update. So
my God.
Let's go ahead and let's dive right into it.
Jeez, big stuff.
There's great news, Tim, as you said, for Hilaria Baldwin, also for Carmen Gabriela, Rafael Thomas, Leonardo Angel, Romeo Alejandro, Eduardo Pau, Maria Lucas, and Hilaria Catalina. Those are the 7 children that Mr. Baldwin has with Hilaria Baldwin. And of course,
man, it's so good. Your accent is
Ireland Baldwin. I did throw that in just for
it could be native Hispanic for all anybody would know. Yeah.
So the big news for real, though, is that the Andrea Reeb is the name of the special prosecutor that was brought on to handle Baldwin's case. And she has resigned. She is a current Republican member of the New Mexico House. And
I didn't know they had any.
Yeah, well, there's,
The token Republican
some in every
Mexico.
state, Tim. No, they can't get rid of them all.
And they try.
But if we think about these things, the power to prosecute is strictly within the executive branch, both with respect to nationally federal prosecutions or locally at the state level, state prosecutions. This is an executive function. And members of the legislature generally are not allowed to perform executive functions, even if they started performing them before they became members of the legislature.
Right.
And that's what the objection was here. And Ms. Reeb has indicated, a little bit of hostility towards Mr. Baldwin because of his celebrity status. And I'm sure, he probably doesn't feel good that she's a Republican. And, he's made statements that indicate that, Republicans are lesser
evil.
than. Yeah, well, there you go. Evil. I was going to use a different word that was.
I saved you the trouble.
Yeah, I was going to use a rated R word for it. But in any case, so that's really good news. It's good news for him. Once again, we have a statement from the prosecutor's office that when you just are doing the thing that you have to do, that you're required to do, it's a little bit much to hoist yourself up and put your cape on and let everybody know that you're a hero for doing it. It's like, well, wait a minute, you have to do it, and that's so. Reeves said, "It has become clear that the best way I can ensure justice is served in this case is to step down so that the prosecution can focus on the evidence and the facts, which clearly show a complete disregard for basic safety protocols led to the death of Lena Hutchins." Now, and then I will not allow questions about my serving as a legislator and prosecutor to cloud the real issue at hand. Well, of course, she's required to step down by the Constitution. So it's not about her letting anything. What the writing's on the wall. Obviously.
It's called spin.
Yeah. And it might be a good thing because it's probably going to be a loser. We saw that last month, last month he got the biggest break. Well, actually, it wasn't even a break. We learned that they charged him inappropriately. They charged him with this firearm enhancement to the crime, which was the one that added all these potential years for a conviction. Over 5 years was the enhancement charge to a law that was passed after he allegedly committed this criminal act. So the funny thing for us, Tim, is, of course, LibertyNation.com, the sponsor of today's podcast, is a subsidiary of One Generation Away, whose mission is to bring America's founding principles to the issues of today. We've got a ex post facto law and now a clash of executive versus legislative powers in the Alec Baldwin Michigas.
It's a constitutional learning moment, right?
Who'd have
A
thunk
teachable moment.
Baldwin just gives so much to the American people.
I know. It's just
through his dramatic arts.
It's practically incalculable, Scott, the contributions that he's made to American society writ large. But
those Kennedy Center honors are well earned, to be sure.
Yes, you can, and you can't. So there's two things, right? We discussed this, I don't know, a week or two ago, that you can't do an ex post facto law that doesn't grandfather in people that were obedient to a different set of laws.
That's what makes it an ex post facto law,
right?
Is that
but
it
also
penalizes behavior that occurred prior to the enactment of the measure.
So, but the other part of it, which I've always found fascinating as to whether somebody would try to breach this, is the Bill of Attainder, which is, right, a law that's passed specifically in order to prosecute an individual person or group of people that is targeted at a specific person or group rather than the
I'll look to Donald Trump becoming the first test case in recent times.
Well, it could be Donald Trump on the giving end or the receiving end of that. Yes, he might be the constitutional lesson in bills of attainder.
One thing that this is great news for Baldwin, just in addition to them following the Constitution and probably replacing this prosecutor with somebody who's probably not a Republican or animated against him for political reasons, is she's done all the work. She knows where the bodies are buried, and to get somebody else up to speed and then up to trial, it's a long delay, likely benefiting Baldwin. So it's, legally speaking, he's in much better shape as well. And I think he's on the road now. I think I said it the last time we talked about it, but he's on the road to a non-custodial plea agreement or something like that. And we ran the headline just like everybody else did. Baldwin facing up to, I don't know if it was quite 6 years or what the total was, but that was before that other charge was knocked out. And now the years just keep.
You think he'll do any more motion pictures, or do you think he's disgraced?
You want to run around the house with 14 kids that only speak Spanish? Come on, get out of here. He's got to get out.
Of course, it gets him out. Because it gets him out of the house,
by the way,
right?
For months at a time. Yeah,
because it gets him
away from his home. He's worshipped there. He's got to go, do this and that. Right? How many nannies do you get for all those kids? There's not enough.
Well, especially when you have a wife with her own, shall we say, professional pursuits.
Oh Lord.
I mean, it's a hard thing to pretend being Hispanic, Scott. It takes constant attention.
Not Hispanic, Spanish.
Oh, excuse me. Oh, no, right.
Yeah.
Right. Spanish.
Right.
European, excuse me. But it takes an equal amount of effort. And the reason is, Scott, because every once in a while to convince people that you are a Spaniard, you got to drop in the lisp, the lisp. You'll have to do
Barcelona.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to say make paella or something. A little bit more
you could
difficult.
do that too. But if you say Barcelona instead of Barcelona like the rest of us, then you're sort of got street cred among, the common Spaniard.
Well, let's transition to another perfect and unintentional transition, because there's another actor, Tim, who was in the news for some misbehavior. Mr. Jussie Smollett, you may recall, was attacked by two men he hired to attack him. He wasn't actually attacked. He said that in his fancy upper end, like trendy, gay friendly neighborhood in Chicago where he lived, that at 2 a.m.
This is mega country.
At 2 a.m. he ran into happened to randomly run into two men dressed in MAGA hats who tried to lynch him or just beat him up and put a noose around his neck.
Of course, this was late
falsely.
at night when he's wearing a cap. Nobody could possibly recognize him. But suddenly these two MAGA enthusiasts were able to instantly pull up his relatively obscure role in TV, right? I mean,
remember, Tim,
some huge star.
He goes hard at, what is Trump's presidential number? He's what? President number
45.
Yeah, he goes hard at 45.
Why do you think you were targeted?
I can just assume. I mean, I come really, really hard against 45. I come really, really hard against his administration. And I don't hold my tongue.
I want to ask you about Jussie Smollett.
I think that's horrible. It doesn't get worse, as far as I'm concerned.
It's so convenient for the left. Everything is a simple solution. Blame Trump.
Yeah, right. Well, it used to be. I don't know.
Worked in 2020.
I don't know if that's still going on or not. But
yes, it is. Yes, it is. Did you not hear where the 46th president of the United States blamed the 45th for the Silicone Valley Bank failure? He said, because the previous administration loosened the regulations.
The thing is, though, worked is the operative part of my statement that we don't yet know if it does, right? Like, we'll see. Meaning,
but if he just drops that in, again,
that's just like a performative. It's just like a figure of speech in any reaction shot. It's like, let's talk about how Trump impacted this negatively. We'll throw that out there. It's like it's part of their religion now. That religion has to include,
Well, that's the blaming Trump is their liturgy.
Yeah.
That's their liturgy. Blame Trump. Pretty soon, it'll be blame DeSantis, because the word's already out there that DeSantis, if this is even possible, DeSantis is even worse than Trump.
Yeah, of course he is.
Even worse. If that's even possible.
He's got to be, until the next person who's even worse than DeSantis.
Yeah, well, that's going to be
a quick
pretty
check
tough.
of the profile for Mr. Jussie Smollett in the IMDb shows that he has no entries past 2017, and so unlike Mr. Baldwin, who I think is going to be acting, Jussie Smollett, I don't know, and especially in the face of this report from Fox Nation, where the Osundairo brothers, one of them was rumored to be either a lover and or escort to Mr. Smollett, and provided him with they were like his drug dealers too, and then also like extras on the set of or at least one of them was an extra on his movie set or TV set, and here they are.
Like I've always said, Scott, those guys, the Osundairo brothers, they're ready for anything. Anything. That's as you just described.
Yeah, let's listen to that.
As you just described.
So I saw him out the corner of my eye, and I was like, okay, that's him. Let's go. Gotta go get this Empire. Yeah, that's him. That's him. Is that him?
That's that nigga.
It's that nigga.
Get that
Let's go.
nigga.
Oh, he's moving fast. Come on, let's get him.
Get that nigga.
Let's get him. As we crossed the street, we said hey to get his attention.
Hey, nigga.
Hey! He turned around, looked at us, and that's when we started yelling the famous slurs he wanted us to yell. Hey!
Aren't you that Empire?
Hey, Empire fat nigga! It's MAGA country.
Yeah.
And then he said, what did you say to me? And then that's when I threw the first punch at him. I held the blow because I didn't want to hurt him, of course. So I made it look real, but I held it. Then we started tussling, moving around, and then I threw him to the ground. He wanted it to look like he fought back. That was very important for him because he said, hey, don't just beat my ass, make it look like I'm fighting back and whatnot. So we did that. And then I threw him to the ground, and after I threw him to the ground, he had no bruise. I wanted it to look more real. So then I threw him to the ground. After I threw him to the ground, I used my knuckle and gave him a noogie. So I went like this. Why did I do that? To give him a scar, to give him a mark, to make it look real, like he really did get his ass beat. After I did that, I fake kicked him. I don't know what he was doing. I wasn't paying attention.
That's where I came around with the bleach, the infamous bleach in the hot sauce bottle, poured it on his shirt. Then I finally put the rope around his face. I did not put it around his neck. I just placed it on his face, and that's when we took off.
This is exactly what we all had deduced had really happened. It's, you know what, it is the ultimate publicity stunt. I mean, it's probably the most elaborate publicity stunt that I can remember. And I don't know whether you want to say it backfired or succeeded, because we all have been talking about Jussie Smollett for like 2 years.
Not since Morton Downey Jr. concocted his own racist assault in a public transportation bathroom at the hands of neo-Nazis has there been a more spectacularly debunked public relations stunt as this.
Well, it could have been Geraldo Rivera and Al Capone's vault, the infamous empty vault. But I'll give.
By the way,
them.
I remember me and my family were gathered around the TV waiting for the big reveal on that one. I bought into it. Rivera got my click on that one. All right, let's transition to your core competency as senior political analyst and talk about before we give up the ghost here and your guest chair to Mr. Moran and Fight and discuss the politics. I want a odds report from you on the latest betting markets and where things stand, and also what to make of this news that I know that you wrote about for the sponsor of today's podcast, LibertyNation.com.
There you go.
And and discussing it to Mr. Pence coming out against the Trump dog. What do you have to say about it?
Well, I think it's actually quite a sad spectacle that a guy who was once, really a serious, yet buttoned down, old time conservative, Christian conservative, has descended to the point where he is engaging in a pointless candidacy that appears to be nothing more than an effort to distance himself from Donald Trump in the annals of history, to show that he had nothing to do with January 6th.
So I want to stop you right there. And say, so that's what it's about, not about his own political aspirations. It's about...
Well, he's got no chance. That's the thing. And everybody, it seems, except him, knows it. There's no appetite for Mike Pence anywhere in the Republican Party, because if you want sort of like an old-time conservative who isn't stained, you've got a Nikki Haley or you've got Mike Pompeo, whatever. But the party has passed him by, even though he was Trump's vice president. Mike Pence is many things, but he's not a populist.
He seems like he's like the Jeb Bush guy. Like pretty
much.
He's not going to do anything crazy. He's not going to say anything untoward.
Which is why he was a perfect choice for vice president. But nobody that I've talked to, not a single one, believes he's really presidential timber. And the pathetic part, Scott, was that he made this announcement that Trump will be held responsible for January 6th at the Gridiron Dinner, which is an old Washington, cut up fest, which is usually pretty funny. But he used it to try and basically suck up to the news media, which will never
which works for the one cycle that they can use you for until they flush you down the drain of
precisely.
I thought you were going to say that he did it in the week when we all got the footage that
I know, and that
revealed that there was so much peaceful activity at
that's the last and that's the last part of it. In politics, timing is everything. And talk about tone deaf. He'd had this prepared for a long time, obviously, for the Gridiron Dinner, but he didn't bother to sort of, shall we say, attenuate his message to the new reality of, let's just put it on Jacob Chansley, the QAnon shaman, so to speak, because he's the face. The left has said it. He's the face of the insurrection, as they call it. Well, when he suddenly looks like a docile guy just walking sort of quietly around the Capitol being escorted after he entered illegally, but so did hundreds of others walk through an open door.
We reported on that last week, but there's another video, Tim, that's come out since we last recorded, and I want to play it for everybody right now. And this is Jacob Chansley on the front of the Capitol saying, hey, please let's heed Donald Trump's words here and go home peacefully. He's standing with his back to the door, like protecting the Capitol. It is truly just to say that it puts the narrative on its head that this guy was some violent person is, here we go.
Respect the landmarks! Respect the Capitol! He said he saw on his Twitter account Donald Trump.
We're going to pull up the tweet. Donald Trump has asked everybody to go home.
Yeah, this just shatters the image of this violent insurrection by hundreds or thousands when it was really a riot among maybe dozens of people. And it just and the left is going ballistic because the biggest thing that they had against Trump, of course, was January 6th. And if he's running again, which he is, and intends to be president, which he does, the biggest argument they had against him just got severely compromised. Because, look, even if you think it was a violent insurrection, the Democrats cannot come forward with the gloves off about January 6th anymore, because Trump and every Republican will have an answer to it, which is now people have seen all the footage that is relevant, right?
Well, I actually think that there's one thing I would disagree with you there is that, no, they haven't seen it all. We're going to see more footage. And the more footage that we see, I think it's going to be all the footage that's yet to be released is likely to be either neutral or exculpatory.
Absolutely,
and
because
so it's a one-way ratchet at this point. Or the Dems would have put it out in their made-for-TV special.
It's a one-way ratchet. Yeah. You're absolutely right. And
all bad
there could be more footage coming out because that stuff of Chansley didn't come out on Tucker Carlson.
They say 40,000 hours or something like that. So
yes.
They could, a lot to go through.
They could let it leak slowly, right up to 2024. But I'll tell you what, this is the kind of break that Donald Trump had to have for his chances to suddenly become ripe again for regaining the Oval Office.
Let's go right to the markets. Then we're a free market organization. We support free markets, and the free market betting. At least, by the way, we have to go to Canada to get these numbers because we don't have free market betting yet in the United States about our election results. But at the at an Ontario casino, they publish these odds. And why don't you go ahead and tell us where things are?
Okay, well, I think that no one will be surprised that Joe Biden at a little over 2-1, about 2.25-1, would be considered the morning line favorite, so to speak, before anybody's
win. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But Donald Trump is just behind him at 3-1. Ron DeSantis is just behind Trump at 7-2, which is basically 3.5-1.
Mm-hmm.
And then everything jumps way up. Kamala Harris, 22-1. Nikki Haley, 25-1. Gavin Newsom, 28-1, but that would change considerably if Biden decides not to run, which seems highly unlikely. It seems certain almost at this point that Biden will run and probably announce sometime in the spring. But I think former Vice President Pence ought to look at these odds too, because he's at plus 5,000, which means that if you bet $100 on Mike Pence, it'd be 500-1 that he wins the presidency.
500-1 or 50-1?
Well, if you put down 5,000, that means for a $100 bet, you're right. It's 50-1.
Yeah.
You're right. So,
right, so let me ask you this. I want you to try to divorce yourself from your wishful thinking and emotions that all humans have, and you're just walking through the casino on a trip to Toronto, and you found a $100 bill on the ground, and you decide, I'm going to go ahead and lay this on one of these just for the money, just to return on your found $100. Which of those bets do you like the most at this moment?
That's a good question. Boy, I could make a case for any of the top three.
I would go with Newsom. I think there's the most value in that bet there, because it seems like easily something could go askew with Biden's dreams of being the next nominee, and
because of his age and advancing sort of.
I didn't want to say it, but yes, that's
cognitive decline.
I'm trying to be a gentleman about it, but that's right, Tim. He faces a number of challenges in that area.
But I think that that Biden, if he was able to survive 2020, admittedly in a basement strategy, I think he can, with an activist media that's will basically serve as his public relations arm. I think he can still survive that stuff, but he's not a good bet at 2.25-1 to me. That's not enough of a payoff. I think I could possibly look at Nikki Haley at 25-1 only because you could see a scenario maybe where Trump and DeSantis cancel each other out, and Nikki Haley comes up from behind as sort of a consensus choice because nobody really
seems like
dislikes her.
A longer shot than the odds indicate to me, from my thinking.
Well, for Newsom, look, if I was a bettor and Joe Biden announced at 10 o'clock in the morning that he's not running, at 10:01, I'd take the 28-1 odds on Gavin Newsom.
I'm sure that the odds makers would be ahead of you.
How about what's your feeling about Kamala Harris at 22-1?
I don't think that the Democrats. So here's the pathway for me with with my bet. I feel like it's pretty easy for something to happen to Joe Biden's candidacy, whether it's his health, whether it's the politics, whether it's something else, where people
Hunter Biden, the border crisis.
There's a dozen pathways to failure.
Yeah.
And so if that happens, then what? To me, is the question. And the answer is not Kamala Harris. And not because I think it probably about the same about
That's
Biden-
just a sober judgment, you know.
Yeah.
She just doesn't have it. They're
That's
trying
right.
to.
Yes.
I can see they're starting to send her out more into the media to try and stick her toe in the water some more and see if she doesn't
Oh yeah.
make a fool out of herself and cackle and laugh at all the wrong times and say vacuous things and repeat the same thing over and over. I mean, she's a loser as a presidential candidate.
And
but
so
I think everybody agrees on that.
So then the question is, who after her? And to me, Newsom just seems like a good money bet. That he would be able to slide it. He's been a very effective politician at winning, office. So,
and he's mostly effective because he looks the part. I mean, if you were casting a president for a movie right now, he would be the guy because he looks it. He's tall, dark, and handsome.
He certainly. It makes sense. Meaning, like, if you're the casting person, the guy comes in and says, "I'm reading for president." You're like, "Yeah, okay, sit over here."
Really, if you think about it, the most delicious matchup would probably be DeSantis against Newsom because you'd have California values against Florida values. Those are bookends of the country right now.
Yeah.
And let's see which values would trump which. I mean, and no pun intended there, by the way, with the Trump thing. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your report. We're going to go ahead and turn your chair over to Mr. Moran for some news on the Silicone Valley Bank, and
I've made sure to put a nice, soft, comfortable cushion on the seat for Andrew and Jim to be able to feel more comfortable than I do in this setting.
You're a gentleman. Thank you so much.
And a scholar, or
okay.
That remains.
If that's what's going to make you happy, then yes.
Sure, whatever. Right. Thanks, Scott.
Welcome back to the Uprising. LibertyNation.com economics editor and Canadian national, Andrew Moran. Andrew.
Thank you for having me. I finally had my first food of the day before I came on, so I'm all ready and energized.
As did I. It's fantastic to get a word in with you. I know that you're busier than a one-legged man in a butt-kicking contest, as the saying goes, because of the Silicone Valley Bank and attenuated fiascos and shenanigans. And so what I wanted you to do is basically pretend that I've been out of the country for 2 weeks. I just came back, from Incommunicado, that great destination, and I just say, what the hell's going on? Because I think that there's a lot of headlines, but just a simple layout of what happened, I think would be helpful in starting the discussion.
All right, so the bank is Silicon Valley Bank. It was founded in 1983. It's in California, the heart of Silicon Valley. It has all of its most of its clients are tech startups, venture capital firms, executives of those companies. So what happened with Silicon Valley Bank was that it offered its customers, in order to attract these high-level customers, it offered them higher deposit rates than you would get at the typical bank. Now, in order to fund those
higher interest rates on simple deposits.
Yes, correct. That's correct.
Okay.
Yes. In order to fund those rates, what it did was that it purchased long-term bonds in order to offset these risks that would occur. The problem is that it started buying the long-term bonds that had a positive cash balance. But then what happened was the Federal Reserve started raising interest rates. When it started raising interest rates, it crashed the bond market. So the valuation of these bonds that the SVB held, they were devalued. They weren't worth much. So then
let me just say this. So what I understand from what you're saying is they've got an excess of cash. They don't want cash to hold. They want to make some money off that cash. So they buy what they perceive as a very low risk or zero risk investment, which is a bond. And then the price of the bond collapses. Now they're insecure. They don't have the money to back it up. Just like if they bought something that was wildly more speculative than a bond. Is that about right?
That's correct. And then in addition to that, there were two other things. The first one was that because they saw the bond valuations decline, they started using any excess capital they had to make other risky investments. And then the second one was that they lent to risky small businesses and risky venture capitalists using their client deposits as well. So of course, when the tech market collapsed, these investments also deteriorated. So that's what added to the whole with bank run on the bank with I think it was $42 billion in a single day. Because if you remember, well, no, sorry, you're out of the country, but SVB they had an announcement saying they needed to raise more than $2 billion in capital in order to sustain offset their losses in the balance sheet. So yeah, so this whole SVB it was a case of mismanagement and in a broader context, the fault of the Federal Reserve.
So the explosion went off basically last week with this. What was the, with the FTX implosion or explosion, it was the Binance guy tweeting about how they were going to dump all their crap coin that they had, essentially that sort of set off that chain of events that where we are now with it. What, I heard all what you said about all those reasons, but was there some triggering event that occurred that made this happen?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. So Patrick McHenry, he's the chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, and he called it that this was the first Twitter-fueled run on the banks. And in a way, he's correct, because if you monitored social media on the Wednesday of the
as
collapse,
you do, by the way, adeptly for the sponsor of today's podcast, LibertyNation.com. You are the Twitter master for us, and we certainly appreciate that. But anyway, you were saying.
Yeah, so if you monitored Twitter that day, there was a lot of calls for people to withdraw their funds at this bank. Peter Thiel, he also had a call to action saying, take your money out of these banks. So a lot of it was social media driven, and then of course the stock market, it started tanking. So people saw the writing on the wall, and that's when they started to access their cash.
Because Silicone Valley Bank is a publicly traded company.
Yeah, it's market capped. I think it was wiped out by about $12 billion in one day on the stock exchange.
And how much of that, hey, take your money out of Silicon Valley Bank by a guy like Peter Thiel, and maybe not necessarily him specifically, but somebody with big presence, somebody who can move markets on social media or help to, how much of that was benefited by or motivated by short positions that they may have had in the underlying stock?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I was wondering that too. So I went to do research on what the floating short was, and actually, surprisingly, it wasn't that high. The float short was at the time was less than 5%. So there wasn't a short presence, and this was probably largely driven by the fact that there was an audit report done, and it found that the firm in question gave it a clean bill of health just a couple of months ago. But what's interesting about that part is that somebody had to know within the company, because the executive at the time, he sold about $3 million 1 or 2 weeks before the bank started collapsing. So I think in that regard, when it comes to the audit report, I think a lot of shorts realized what was going on. But hindsight's 2020.
Andrew, Jim Cramer himself gave the bank high marks. Let's take a quick listen.
Cramer.
Let's take a quick listen to what Cramer had to say.
The ninth best performer year to date is SVB Financial, don't you want? This company's a merchant bank with a deposit base that Wall Street had been mistakenly concerned about. SVB is the old Silicone Valley Bank. Recently bought one of our favorite research firms, Nathanson, and it's become less dependent upon private equity and venture capitalist offerings. Wait a second. Those dried up last year, they could come back. Yes, some of them come back here, but the stock directly affects an oversold position. Stock was the fourth worst performer in 2022. I think the fears were not justified, and it's a very compelling situation. Hey, by the way, long-term private equity and venture capital, they're not going away. Being the banker to these immense pools of capital has always been a very good business. Stock's still cheap. Now, you have to remember that a stock that falls 66%, like SVB Financial did last year, it takes it a lot more to recover. After losing 2/3 of your value, you need a 200% gain to get back to even. This is arithmetic. Some people call it geometry. So you could argue SVB's nearly 40% rally this year is barely a drop in the bucket. And that's how I want you to think it. I think it's also a good example of why these bounce back moves might be far from over. These stocks could have more room to run. especially if you think they were driven down to artificially low levels by tax loss selling, artificial dumping.
Jim Cramer, so there's actually an ETF now called Inverse Cramer, and they invest in stocks.
This is like the Contra Krugman. I love this.
Because this guy, every time, it's so funny. If you go back on Twitter, you go back to CNBC, every time he says, this stock is wonderful, this ETF is great, this is the best time to buy, the exact opposite happens. And this guy, he used to be a hedge fund manager, and he's a host on the biggest business news network in the world. He gets it wrong continually.
I remember some years back reading that Steve Forbes got an award, and I wish if I thought about it before now, I would have looked it up before we went to recording, which is why I don't have the information at hand, but it was an award for accuracy in financial forecasting or predictions. So it was like, whoever calls these people to account for, for their predictions, right? I wonder, where would Cramer be on the ranking agency? I remember when I first tried to follow a couple stocks, a couple of companies to think about, as an investing vehicle, and just the volume of information I wanted to keep up with their 10K filings, with their other filings, and news about them, and gossip about them, and the marketplace in general. And I would see Jim Cramer, field these calls on was Squawk Box or whatever his show was, and
Mad Money.
Mad Money. There you go. And it would be like these dozens and dozens of companies, and he would say, like, somebody said, like, oh, what do you think about, Widgets Incorporated? And he'd say, oh, I like him in the whatever, it's a buyer. Like, but he didn't read all that stuff about all these companies. It's just like this sort of hot take, seat of the pants stuff, but real money's involved.
Lightning round is one segment of the show. But what's funny about Jim Cramer is that he's also infamous in the fact that she said that a Washington Mutual was a great purchase, and then 1 week later the bank fails. And also you mentioned Forbes. Actually, 1 week before the collapse of, or maybe 2 weeks before the collapse of SVB, Forbes magazine said that SVB was one of the best banks in the whole United States. So that shows a lot of people. I mean, it makes you wonder, where do they get analysis from? Are they just piggybacking what other people say? What's going on with the financial analysis these days?
Well, one of the things I want to ask you about is just as we get into some details about it is one of the kind of more interesting, I think for me, parts of the financial collapse of 2007 and 8 is and demonstrated by what's the name of the movie?
Big Short.
The Big Short is the rating agency corruption. How they're basically just crap. Is that the case with the banks now as well? Because it seems like we have a rating agency that, given a healthy checkup to this bank, and it didn't deserve it, right?
Yeah, well, that's part of my question. So from the question that audited SVB, they gave it a clean bill of health. They said it was great. And then when they were asked about it just last week, saying, how did you get it so wrong? They said, well, it's not up to us. It's not our responsibility what happens after we do the audit. But the problem with that fact is that this thing didn't spring up overnight. It didn't happen just in one day. The whole bond market started crashing starting last spring with the Fed tightening policy. So the company must have started showing signs of risk, because that's the whole point of a financial audit. You're supposed to identify risks forming in a certain company. And also Moody's came out. You're talking about credit rating agencies. Moody's came out just a few days ago, and they said that the whole U.S. banking system was downgraded to negative. So I think that's also worth talking about when you're talking about ratings agencies.
To what extent, if any, did the woke sort of like, I've seen on Twitter and such, like they'll point to the bio of one of the Silicone Valley Bank executives, and it'll be like, they're all about diversity and inclusion and, unicorns and fairy tales. Like, was it run by a bunch of, for lack of a better term, sort of, these wokeists who lost the ball for making money to doing this other stuff, to the extent that you can glean it from what you've seen?
Well, I'm not going to primarily blame wokeness or ESG for what happened at SVB. I do find it comical that when you usually see a company fail or a company lose money, there's always a sense of wokeness attached to it, behind the scene. One of their executives, I think, who appointed was an LGBT plus Q queer person or something along those lines.
Hopefully more than one if they weren't a bigoted leadership, Andrew. as well.
I spoke to an economist the other day, and he said that if the management focused more on the balance sheet as opposed to being diverse and woke, then perhaps the situation wouldn't have unfolded. And a lot of experts I've always they tend to agree with that synopsis.
So you think it is
a lot of economists aren't as woke as most people are.
So it might have actually been the wokeness that did them in.
No, I don't think it's woke as did it. I think the Federal Reserve is the one that did it in, because it's the Federal Reserve that has contributed to these problems, not just in the last couple of years, but also before then too. And then also regulation has been.
Give us a thumbnail sketch Give us a thumbnail sketch of what the Federal Reserve is doing wrong that allowed this, that they could change and do differently. Assuming, and I don't mean a wholesale like we eliminate the Federal Reserve as an entity. Like, I get that, and for me, I encourage people to look more into that and learn about why the Federal Reserve is anti-liberty and the creation of money is anti-liberty. But let's assume that we're not going to get quite that wish list of what the true free market economists and you and I would have happened. But
Okay, so I won't go back all the way to 2008, because that's also another can of worms. I'll just go back to 2020. That's when the Federal Reserve unleashed the mother of all monetary easing bombs by slashing interest rates to zero, injecting the market with $6 trillion in liquidity. That easy money contributed to this mess, because all these companies, especially the tech sector and the financial sector, which mostly benefited from this, they made all these risky bets. They made all these investments. They did all this, I
just want to slow down just a bit, because I'm getting what you're saying, but I want to make sure everybody who is not used to your pace can get it too. What you're saying is, by lowering the cost to borrow money to almost zero, you encourage more borrowing, less responsible borrowing, and basically more risky measures, because why not? The cost of failure is low.
And then to piggyback off that, there's two then scenarios unfolding from that. Was that when the Federal Reserve tightened to 5% in 1 year, the banking system could not endure that. Obviously, when you're seeing these banks fall and potentially more dominoes to fall, it shows they cannot endure just even slightly higher interest rates than what they've been accustomed to since 2007, 2008. And then the second part, when you talk about taking risks, the Federal Reserve and the federal government facilitate this behavior because of the constant bailouts and overregulation, because it costs more to run a bank when you're highly overregulated. That enables them to take these risks. So it's the federal government and Washington that have added to this constant barrage of bank failures and bank crises.
I'll add one other element, which is that the overregulation leads consumers and depositors and investors all to think, I don't need to be an active consumer of information and worry about what these people are doing. Unlike the widget factory, where they might want to make sure that the manager there is, schooled in widgets, because they think, well, there's so many layers of protection here for that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So I just made one thing. This is called moral hazard in economics. It's a well-known term, especially to describe this type of environment, because one party is incentivized to take a risk because they're not going to bear the full responsibility of the costs of that risk. So the Fed is enabling moral hazards even before the whole banking crisis started.
Thank you for that. Is that about it in terms of this crisis for the immediate term or the near term, or is this an avalanche that's going to start, or have things stopped now?
I think if there is,
we're recording on the 15th of March for the record.
Okay, well, I think there's a couple of things to this, though. It's hard to answer with a simple answer. I think if a big bank is the next one to fail or show any signs of collapsing, then you're going to have an avalanche of problems, especially on the inflation front. Because let's use SVB as our example again. They had about $150 billion or even some say $175 billion in deposits, both insured and uninsured. The FDIC wants to bail them out, bail all the depositors, but how much does it have in its reserves? $125 billion. That's as much as $50 billion gap. What's the Federal Reserve going to do? It's going to bail out the rest, and it's going to bail out all uninsured and insured depositors, especially if another big bank fails, like Credit Suisse or whatever the case, Charles Schwab, First Republic, whatever the case. So the inflationary aspect is what you should be really concerned about, because everyone's going to just bail out.
So when the Fed bails out a bank, they just print the money to do it. There's no actual fund that they're withdrawing the money from. Is that right?
Well, yes, they have to, but why do they have to do that?
Wait. Yes, they have to what? Is there a fund that they're drawing from, or are they just printing the money to do it?
Well, there isn't, for the Federal Reserve, there isn't a fund. If you look at their balance sheet, they actually have a negative income. They turn negative.
Okay, so there is no reserve account.
No, there isn't.
All right, well, that's what, by the way, I'm just trying to get the information from you. All right, that's fine.
No, it's just
so they
frustrating.
Just start printing money, and they just inflate the currency even more when there's a bailout like that.
Yeah, exactly. And if the Federal Reserve is going to go as far as guaranteeing these mark-to-market bills, which means that they're going to buy a lot of these instruments or the securities that these banks hold at face value as opposed to market value, that's going to be trillions of dollars in printed money if more banks collapse. So the inflation aspect for 2024 should be really concerning if the whole financial system is under threat by
which leads us into our, I think maybe our last topic, why I have you here, Andrew Moran, economics editor for LibertyNation.com, the sponsor of today's podcast, and you're also the host of the Swamponomics show that you created for LN, which I recommend to everyone. Even when we're not in the depths of a potential economic crisis and panic, it's a good show, and especially perhaps when we are. Bitcoin. It looked like initially Bitcoin was taking a hit, and then, like I said, we're recording on the 15th of March. The last I checked, it was up quite a bit the last day or so. It seems like, from my, I know compared to like the average human being on earth plucked from the street, I know a ton about Bitcoin, but for a real Bitcoin insider, I feel like I'm pretty ignorant. But it seems like anytime the dollar is going to be devalued and there's shenanigans with banks and regulation, boy, Bitcoin should shine in that by comparison. And anyway, that's my thought. What do you think about it?
I used to agree, but I no longer agree with that assessment. I don't think it is a safe haven hedge. I don't think it's a safe haven asset. I don't think it's great to protect yourself against inflation, because we saw that when the Federal Reserve started raising interest rates, that's when the value of cryptocurrency started crashing. It's nothing more than a speculative asset at this point, as opposed to gold and silver. Although, of course, they're prone to the opportunity cost of interest rates. But overall, but the reason why Bitcoin is rallying right now is on the prospect. If you look at the futures market, the prospect is that the Federal Reserve is going to slash interest rates by 100 basis points over the next 12 months. So that's a flood of easy money going back into the economy in that regard. So you're going to see a lot of speculative investments again in the broader context of the stock market because of easy money policies being reinvigorated by the Fed. At least that's the expectation.
When you say the basis points, translate that for those of us who don't follow those terms. They've raised, so in the past year, it's been increased by how many points?
Yeah, it's funny because there's people on Twitter, they say that to economists. Some people say, just say what the percentage is. Stop saying what the basis points are. Right. So 500 basis points, that's 5%. So looking over the next 12 months, the futures market is betting that the Fed's going to cut rates by 1%.
Yeah, that would be more helpful way to digest the information for those of us non-economists. Okay. Am I missing any other aspect of the story that's key to understanding it or wrapping our heads around it or thinking about it from a free market, liberty-based perspective?
Well, from a free market liberty-based perspective, I would not have bailed out the depositor whatsoever, especially when it comes to SVB. SVB are not just mom-and-pop depositors. There are these wealthy executives in Silicon Valley who benefit from all this easy money and wokeness and public policy intervention. But overall, I don't think depositors should ever be bailed out because it's their responsibility to comb through the balance sheets, understand what's going on with the broader context of the markets. Or, at the same time, if you do support deposit insurance, then what you should be doing is that if you reach that maximum threshold of $250,000, then any remaining sum should just put into another bank account. So you keep maxing out that threshold without worrying about being bailed out or not. But now, considering that the Fed is just having QE infinity, I don't think that's even much of a concern anymore in the U.S. economy moving forward.
The real free market answer is have deposit insurance that's sold privately, right? And then therefore,
better.
That would be the right way to do it. It seems the other thing too. It seems like who gets to decide whether deposits in excess of $250,000 are covered? It seems like a giveaway that just some rando bureaucrat in the department gets to make this decision. Like, oh no, you know what? We're not going to do it, or yeah, we will do it. Meanwhile, if the contract doesn't cover it, right? If it just seems like in what area can a regulator issue me a check for $250K because they think it's a good idea, if the law doesn't mandate it or require it.
Well, there's talk now of actually
it's an awfully discretionary use of funds.
There's talk of raising the limit to $600,000, and there's actually talk among House Republicans of guaranteeing all deposits, which that would count for trillions of dollars.
Yeah.
I think the last number I saw, the banking asset deposits was, I think, nearly $18 trillion. So I don't know how the government would have such money.
Yeah, I'd like to see, they could even, I hate to even propose this because, of course, it goes against my all I think is good, but they can even subsidize the private insurance, like to start with, maybe like start off at X subsidy and then going down to zero in a few years when the market develops. But the problem you have is, who cares if, I don't mean this in a mean way, but like if Pete Thiel, he's got a team to worry about his money, but it's the person who just sold their house and they're waiting, 3 months while they're going to stay somewhere else before they buy another house that they've got, money that, doesn't make them rich, right? But they're well in excess of 250. What are they going to do if they, and they just went to, there was a branch down the street, everybody goes there. It's, how do you fix that? Sort of, to me, the difficult.
Maybe because I have too much time on my hands as part of my job. I look at the balance sheet of my local bank, and I know exactly how much is in reserves, how much debt they have, what investors are saying.
It's not because you have too much time on yourself. It's just because you're you, which makes you beautiful and perfect in your own way, and also not like anybody else. Who I'm confident of all the listeners of this podcast, you're the only one who has examined their bank's balance sheet like that. But people can correct me if I'm wrong in the Twitter. Follow the Uprising on Twitter. With a boost from Andrew Moran, occasionally with the retweet, running our feed. And, of course, once again, the host of the Swamponomics program and available at LibertyNation.com and some other places, too, which we won't mention. But thanks so much for joining us this week, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
Cheers. Thank you, Andrew. Now on to Jim Fight and a rundown of this Biden executive order on guns. Welcome back to the Uprising, James Fight. LibertyNation.com editor-at-large, Jim. And you also, you're probably would if there were a firearms editor, you and I might compete for the
right.
for the title.
I think we both have so much already going on with, and I'm going to try to get this right, Scott.
For sure.
LibertyNation.com.
Yeah.
That we could probably share the role.
I think if it was like up to like building a Class 3 firearm, you would be the person to do it, and to file the paperwork for it, maybe I would be the person to do it. That's sort of
how powers combined.
How it would break down. Right. All right. Not that either of us would ever contemplate either of those things in reality. But you covered the Biden, the latest Biden gun grab, or whatever we're calling it, the executive order that Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. announced to the American people this week. And what's the deal? What's the point of this? I want your hot take on this. What's the point of it all?
Well, my initial impression was that it is a lot of virtue signaling, because this is it's a little over 1,200 words, and almost half of it is just talking about, hey, we have a mass shoot. We're mourning a new mass shooting every couple of days, and here's what we need to do. Here's what I've already done. But there is, on a deeper read, there is some potential.
Well, before you get on the deeper read, let's just say he spent, I think, in a 20-minute or 19-minute, I'm looking at the White House's edited YouTube posting of this announcement, the video. Right. He went for 19 minutes, and it was at 13 minutes and 3 seconds when he actually stopped talking about the preliminaries with the Chinese proverbs and the parade of victims and all the horribles, and actually got to the meat of it. Let's give Joe a listen here for just a minute for what he said. Like, okay, now what I'm proposing is X.
Right.
In the meantime, my executive order directs my Attorney General to take every lawful action possible to move us as close as we can to universal background checks without new legislation. It's just common sense. to check whether someone is a felon, a domestic abuser, before they buy a gun. The executive order also expands public awareness campaigns about the red flag orders, laws, which my son, before he died, Attorney General in Delaware, was a great proponent of and instituted. So more parents, teachers, police officers, health providers, and counselors know how to flag for a court that someone is exhibiting violent tendencies, threatening classmates, or experiencing suicidal thoughts that make them a danger to themselves and others, and temporarily remove that person's access to firearms. And it promotes, this executive order, safe storage for firearms, something every responsible gun owner agrees with. Second thing it does, the executive order ramps up our efforts to hold the gun industry accountable. It's the only outfit you can't sue these days. It does that by calling out for an independent government study that analyzes and exposes how gun manufacturers aggressively market firearms to civilians, especially minors, including by using military imagery.
The first thing that really sticks out to me is Biden talking about this is how we're going to get closer to actually getting universal background checks without. Yeah, I mean, specifically, safer communities, blah, blah, blah.
Right,
but
specifically. A safer America, Jim.
Yeah. Specifically closer to actual universal background checks without legislation. And I mean, I put extra emphasis on without, he said, without legislation.
I think it's instructive that you didn't want to talk about Bo's dream for red flag laws. We'll put a pin in that and come back to it in a second. Yes, of course. This to me is it's just a follow on from Donald Trump's bump stock ban and the Biden administration's own brace rule. This idea that they're just going to go ahead and proceed with agency rulemaking if they can't get a law. Barack Obama famously said, "I've got my phone and a pen," right? And when he didn't get the Congress to cooperate, and it seems like that's what we have here. Is it any different?
No, it's essentially the same thing. And I don't know how close he'll actually come to getting that universal background check, but it's pretty clear when even without listening to him set it up, when you read the executive order, he talks about redefining, or not redefining, sorry, I think they use the term clarifying what it requires, what is, who would be required to get an FFL, federal firearms license. And the first thing that popped in my mind was like, man, so like, okay, I've got a gun and I'm like, hey, Merry Christmas, Scott, no problem. But if I've got a gun and I'm like, hey, Scott, I'll sell you this gun for, $200 or something like that. Like, there's no specifics in there, but it struck me as one of those things where, like, I feel like they're going to try to sneak in there. Like, if you sell more than one gun, then you have to be an FFL.
How about this? How about if you're an American who's a firearms enthusiast and you have a dozen guns? And for people who aren't in the gun culture,
that sounds excessive, but it really isn't.
Who don't know, having a dozen guns is not at all excessive, and I probably know 30 people that have a dozen guns. It's not that big a deal. So let's say you are a person in the gun culture. You have your dozen guns, and you're selling the main family home, and you're retiring to Florida, not as a refugee, but as just somebody who's going there like people used to do before they needed to escape from the northern states for
when what you were escaping was the weather, basically.
Right. Perfectly stated. And you're going to reduce your inventory. You're going to only go down there with 3 guns or so because you're no longer hunting, and you're so then to me that's where it comes in, where it's like now you're a dealer, because now instead of just selling maybe that one gun a year or every few years you're selling a gun. Now
whatever arbitrary limit they put on you.
You want to sell more than half a dozen guns like right away. And that to me is where we're going to see. I think that what happens is Garland says, here's our report. This makes somebody a dealer. They just pull a number out of the air, and then they say, without any legislation to do so, this now governs how Americans can, dispose of their property, and just makes the government a partner in any firearms transaction.
Yeah, and the thought that came to mind when I read that, again, I read it before I actually saw and heard Biden talk about specifically specifically saying this is how we're going to get universal background checks with that legislation, was that, okay, if he can't add regulations to private firearm sales, why not just redefine the private firearm sale? And if you can do away with
a whole host of ways for our governance, just go ahead and change what Nazi is, and then you get to
It's basically what they did with the pistol brace. I mean,
I was chatting with Mark Angelides, LN's managing editor on Liberty Nation Radio this week, and
you're still better at it than I am. It sounds better when you do.
And
I gave it my best shot, though.
I was talking. Everybody can participate. It's fun to say. I was talking to him about how what I thought one of the things that Biden is doing is he's signaling, on a couple of different instances of the executive order, he says the secretary of this and the secretary of that, and basically announcing like the whole cabinet should do whatever they can to go full court press on, anti-gun measures. And I was saying that this seems to be like a call to arms to like everybody know we're going to revert back to like where the Clinton administration was. And for people who don't remember, in the Clinton administration, it wasn't just like the Department of Justice who was anti-gun or their legislative liaisons, which is sort of more typical of how gun control politics worked in this country. It was now we have every single federal agency is going to try to take a bite out of gun rights that they can.
Yeah.
And I was looking up, remember Andrew Cuomo famously was one of the leaders of those charges. And he was secretary of, he was the HUD secretary, Housing and Urban Development, and basically tried to make sure that people who were in subsidized housing couldn't have firearms. And he tried to basically sue Smith & Wesson into bankruptcy and change the way, in a lot of ways, that sort of the gun culture worked in the country by inducing that. And we won't have to go 3 layers deep, but eventually what happened was great, which was Gaston Glock, who, in addition to inventing perhaps up against John Browning for most influential firearms developer and engineer, when they went to Glock and said, will you agree to these gun control law changes? They said, well, we'll see how the election goes. And that tanked it for the Clintons when they lost to Congress. So,
right.
Anyway, that seems to me what the call to arms is. If you're
wasn't it Clinton that and I mean, obvious pun, sorry, it's low hanging fruit, but wasn't it Clinton who tried to weaponize the CDC?
Yes,
yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
You pick the agency, and we can go back during the Clinton administration and say, and it's good that you brought that up, because we'll often see, those of us that are in the sort of the gun war on the Twitter and in social media, there'll be a frequent criticism of the Republican administrations that like the CDC can't do gun studies; they're barred from it, like it is some kind of nefarious scheme. But all it is an attempt for those of us who value gun rights and wanted them to see them defended, is to prevent the undermining of those rights with our own taxpayer dollars by something outside their purview. It would be just like if Republicans mandated that the CDC did like extensive studies on like the negative effects of abortions, just for the sake of having that data to then beat people over the head with the idea that abortions have negative consequences.
And that's a good example, Scott, because the CDC does in fact track abortions. It also tracks firearms deaths. So it's not like the CDC is just told to stay out of it entirely. I mean, if it's a cause of mortality,
if there's data, it's their conclusions that we don't trust, and it's also their definitions. Just like you said, you change the definition. Jon Stewart. Oh man, I got to play this.
Why? Because the government does have a responsibility to protect. I'm sorry? The government does have a responsibility in certain instances to
What's the
protect children.
leading cause of death amongst children in this country? And I'm going to give you a hint. It's not drag show readings to children.
Correct, yes.
So what is it?
I'm presuming you're going to say it's firearms.
No, I'm not going to say it like it's an opinion. That's what it is. It's firearms. more than cancer, more than car accidents. And what you're telling me is you don't mind infringing free speech to protect children from this amorphous thing that you think of. But when it comes to children that have died, you don't give a flying fuck to stop that, because that shall not be infringed. That is hypocrisy at its highest order.
When the pro-gun side kind of pares that statistic back and takes a look at it, what we find is that those are included like late teenagers that are like gang members in, in cities that are the exact people that like you're afraid are gonna murder you when you go to park your car. Like, it's not, you say children in a statistic, and we're all thinking of 7-year-olds. We're thinking of the Trayvon Martin in the photograph, not the one that tried to murder George Zimmerman the night that he tried to kill him for no reason, basically, right? So that's sort of, if you're more than 200 pounds and you're over 6 feet tall, like maybe you don't get to count as a child for the violence statistic would be a good rule.
Yeah. Well, and while we're on the topic of definitions and skewing the narrative, it goes even deeper than just that. Like Biden said when he first started, when he opened his speech yesterday, he said it's like every few days we're mourning a new mass shooting, and so you're like, man, that's a lot of. When we say mass shooting, what do we normally think of? We think of like school shootings, nightclubs, supermarkets, all that stuff.
I like it, absolutely.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
All right. So I use. I'm big on the statistics. So I use the gun violence archive to track some of these things, because it is definitely an anti-gun left-wing outfit, but they're 100% on top of tracking the crimes. And so I counted up the number of mass shootings that we've had since March began. At time of recording, it's the 15th of March, and there have been 20 alleged mass shootings. If you look at the very top one, it's a case in Birmingham, Alabama, where a guy broke into a home, killed 2 people, left, broke into another home, and killed 2 other people. That's not even a mass shooting. That's a spree killing.
Horrible crimes that have nothing to do with what the common understanding of these mass shootings is.
But psychologically and
lies,
socially and
damn lies,
politically,
and statistic, and that is
it's a whole different thing
so
behind it.
That accounts for, I think, so much of the resistance to let these federal bureaucrats kind of make hay with, when you combine. Look, we saw with Letitia James what happens when you give somebody, the keys to the car and like no accountability to just enforce their policy proposals with the power of their office. You get somebody who says, let's shut down the NRA entirely. Why? Well, because the guy who's at the head of it is corrupt. Well, what about those of us that are victims of that corruption? Do we get protection from you? The attorney general for this? No, your protection is go start a new organization.
The millions of people like us who have NRA swag.
Yeah. It's hilarious if it wasn't, so tragic.
That's one of those, if you don't laugh, you're going to cry kind of situations.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing too is just the notion of, for people who don't know, the President of the United States doesn't need to produce a publicly available executive order to the Attorney General to get him to deliver some report in 3 months if he wants it. He can just pick up the phone and say, hey, by July 1st, I better have a report on my desk that specifies A, B, and C, right? The whole purpose of a lot of this is either or both that publicity thing or the or the driving lawmaking through policy making in the future. For the publicity thing, he said, this is one of those things that really does kind of get me a little bit crazy personally. So to the extent I can be detached from it is difficult. But the red flag laws, which I think, I've seen I worked in the abuse courts in this country, which is to say that survivors of domestic abuse would go to court and petition to have a protection from abuse order entered against their intimate partner that they were seeking protection from. And I was a lawyer who represented people who were victim survivors of domestic abuse. And also, I represented at least one, if not more people who I suspected were not victims of domestic violence, but were using the laws that favor especially women, but generally people who claim to be victims of domestic violence for their own benefit, to get stuff, to be able to clean out the house while the guy was put out by the cops, or access accounts, or otherwise gain favor with the kids. Like, there's all kinds of reasons why people game the system.
Oh, and yeah. And I mean, one of them is an old saying. I won't go through the whole thing, but I mean, hell hath no fury, right? I mean,
yeah, well, yeah.
You know.
And so, now that was by far, like I said, I'm pretty sure it happened once, but I don't know if it happened more than that. But I know that most of the time it didn't happen, and I don't think that's necessarily true for the extreme risk protection orders or red flag laws that they're talking about. But there will be lots of times in the aggregate where somebody is just mad at somebody who has guns. You know what you can do to somebody who covets their gun collection that really would drive them nuts is you get the government to go take their guns away. And if we have, so that's one of the other things, of course, that he said in the clip is, for Bo, do it for Bo, Jim. I mean, come on, do something. Yeah. Do something. How do you sit there and do nothing?
Do something. Not just do something, Scott. Do something big.
Yeah, do it big.
Yeah.
God forbid. By the way, you wish that Bo could have been against it. At least then maybe this guy would have been like, well, it's like, so whatever this guy had, this dead guy had a mind to support. Now we got to get locked into as national policy. It's set in amber. It's scary to me because that's the thing where I really feel like, the government being involved in the transaction, the danger I see of that is the future imposition of a tracking database where they get access to whoever has the guns. That's the danger from a
I know we try to avoid making the historical, the obvious and famous historical reference there, but I mean that there was before there was gun confiscation, leading up to World War II, there was a gun registry with the exact same logic behind it that we're using today.
With that technology too, by the way, now, I mean, you think of the way data can move and who you can geotag and you can do everything else.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they could lock down guns in an anti-free regime without protections so quickly. It would be staggering.
And
I think,
at least in the beginning, without the general population even knowing about it.
That's the concern with the sort of sales registry or check, and then the extreme risk protection order is, what do they have to prove to take your guns away? And when they take them away, what do you have to do to get them back? One of the things that people may not know about is it is often very difficult to get seized property back from police. I can tell you this: if you have, property that was seized by the police that was perhaps evidence or maybe evidence of a crime, and they lawfully seized it, do you want to have to go hire a lawyer, to go get it back? That is something that's going to cost you thousands of dollars. And that's if it's an easy case. If it's just, hey, you know what, this police department is not that responsive. And who seizes those guns? So if it's like the sheriff's office, then maybe if you get a responsive one, it's good. But what if you get one that's hostile? It's so funny, right? Like, everybody thinks about these cops being uncooperative when it's kind of like on their team they're uncooperative with. But guess what? That happens to every side. So what I mean by that is, there are places where Black Lives Matter maybe get a hostile reception if they go, and I'm thinking of some Florida sheriffs that might, not support them, or if you're a MAGA group or Proud Boys somewhere else in the Northeast with Democrat mayors and such. But the same is true with these things. So if you live in a place where there's an anti-gun sheriff, maybe he makes you go, a year before you get your guns back, and just forget about the practical hunting or self-defense or just general right to keep and bear arms aspects of that. Just to have the frustration of dealing with that, for such a long time. Where are these protections in the law? I don't see them.
Oh yeah, no, I don't either. And there are other reasons you might not want to have an adversarial relationship with your local police, by the way. Like, maybe that could easily stretch outside of that one gun issue.
Boy, it seems like on the one hand you get, no police to there's like violence on public transportation or attacks in the middle of the street, and there's just more funding for bail for people who commit those things. And at the same time, those who are interested in, solving their own need for self protection are just going to get punished for it.
There's what I'd like to be the easy answer, Scott. We could just repeal the NFA, the GCA, and all that good stuff, and just go back to the Wild West. It wasn't actually all that wild.
From your lips to God's ear, Jim. We will keep in touch with your writings and opinions on this issue on the pages of LibertyNation.com, our proud sponsor. And thanks for joining us. We'll see you hopefully sometime on an upcoming episode as well. Thank you, Jim, and thanks to Andrew and Tim, and of course to you at home or in the car or wherever you may consume the podcast. Back now on YouTube. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Tell a friend and share the word. We need the help, and you're the one that can give it to us. We'll see you next week.
We are the Uprising.
Entertaining, informative, and just plain fun. Watch Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5. Produced by conservatives for conservatives. C5's The Left Free Zone. Hosted by Liberty Nation's Lisa K. Garner. Joined by a raucous, irreverent panel of authors. Deconstructing leftist narratives. Debating the hot topics. And remembering to laugh. Join the official conservative safe space.
You only did that to piss Jeff off.
Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5.
That's it for this edition of The Uprising. Remember to hit Liberty Nation News for original articles, LN Radio, and our signature television program, The Conservative 5. Just go to LibertyNation.com on your browser or hit Rumble, YouTube, or check out our Liberty Nation News Roku channel. I'm Scott Cosenza. Thanks for joining The Uprising. This program is a production of LibertyNation.com, where truth is making a comeback.